Okay, so I want to finish up. We were discussing some big themes with respect to Yibum and Chalitza, and I want to go back to that for a minute. So the last thing we discussed was whether or not the obligation of Yibum. Again, we're talking
So,
about. One second, let me just. It's hard to hear because
but I cannot hear you. I cannot hear
yeah.
you.
Just maybe we'll give him 1 second so we can solve
Okay,
the
thank
problem.
you.
Yeah. Okay, sounds like we're good. Oh, maybe not.
Well, I spoke to Jacob Lippman. He knows that we can hear him very loud and clear.
Okay, we're still hearing something.
Okay, hopefully I'll call him again. But I told him we can hear him over you. That was the message. Couldn't have been clearer.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, so we've been discussing who is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. In other words, when a man dies and he doesn't produce any children, and so that's the background of Yibum. The question is whether or not there's an obligation. It's very hard to hear. Whether the obligation is imposed on the Yavam, on the brother-in-law only, or is it also an obligation to the sister-in-law? That is the question. So the Rajba in the Tshuva, Simin Yud Chelik Aleph, Simin Yud Ches, tries to explain that the woman is not um, able to make a bracha on Yibum. There's some question whether the man can make a bracha on Yibum. But the woman cannot make a bracha on Yibum because since she's not obligated in the mitzvah of Kirya Verivia, so she is therefore excluded from the mitzvah of Yibum. And if she's excluded from Yibum, she would not make a bracha either. Is everybody here able to hear? I'm not able to hear myself, but
I'm able to hear you, Rabbi.
What's that?
I'm able to hear you.
Okay, good. So that is the
everyone is on mute. Here we are.
That's the view of the Rajba. The Sefer Chinuch, which we have in these new Marmakomos, which I want to discuss a few things with tonight. If you look at the Sefer Chinuch on page 1 of the most recent Marmakomos, I hope everybody has them. So the Sefer Chinuch explains about the mitzvah of Yibum, B'noheges mitzvah zu b'chol makom u'b'chol zman b'zacharim. That the obligation of Yibum applies to the man. The woman, is of course she's going to be the one who's marrying this fella, but it's not her obligation; it's his obligation. However, the Aruch LaNer and others disagree, and the reason that they disagree is because the Gemara applies the principle of ase dochalos ase, a positive command overrides a negative command, in a situation where there's a yibum circumstance of chayve lavin. Chayve lavin, for example, a Kohen is not allowed to marry a grusha, and meaning a divorcee. A Kohen gadol is not allowed to marry even an almana, even a widow. But let's say that a grusha, somebody who previously was divorced, was married to the Kohen's was married to the Kohen's gadol's. Let's say it this way: a woman was married to the Kohen gadol's brother, so she's now a widow, and he is the only one that can do the yibum. He's the brother. So the Gemara says that we apply the principle of asay dochalo. This is the Gemara in Daf Chaf Amud Aleph in Yevamos. We've seen it already. That in that circumstances, we apply the principle of asay dochalos asay. A positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, and therefore, at least the beginnings of that relationship are secured. So the Kohen Gadol can be miyabim; he can do yibum even with an almana. So the Gemara, so the Bali Tosas, and others are troubled, and the Achronim in particular are troubled. How could it be that we apply the principle of a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment when there are two partners involved in this action, the husband and the wife, or the man and the woman? the brother-in-law and the sister-in-law. So the man falls under the category of aseh dochalos aseh because he's obligated in yibum. At the same time, there otherwise would have been a prohibition because he's a Kohen Gadol and she's an almana. So his mitzvah aseh to do yibum overrides his lav, his lo aseh, right, not to have a relationship, with an almana. But when it comes to her, she's also involved in this relationship. She has lalav, meaning as an almana, she's not allowed to be involved with a Kohen Gadol, but she doesn't have the positive pressure of the mitzvah of Yibum, according to the Rajba, according to the Sefer Chinuch, according to the Rambam, all of whom seem to say that the mitzvah devolves only on the Yavam and not on anyone else, not on the woman. If she's not included in the obligation, the positive mitzvah, how is she able to justify the violation of the lav? So for that reason, the Aruch LaNer and maybe the Pnei Yehoshua come to the conclusion that the Rajba is wrong, that the Chinuch is wrong, that the Rambam is wrong, that she really is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. Because otherwise, how could she participate on the basis of mitzvah saseh dochalos aseh, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? She has the negative, but she doesn't have the positive. So
why do you is it insisted upon that we apply the principle of esed dochalos aseh when there's another principle which subtracts any negative commandment altogether? And I have in mind the bringing a korban on Shabbos. There also there's an essay, and there's an olos essay, but we don't apply that principle. We say that in this context, the requirement is that is the mitzvah that is in fact spelled out, notwithstanding any subsidiary and actually from this point of view irrelevant both says.
Well, so two things. Actually, the Mechilta in Parshas Yisro does make a comparison, as Rabbi Roth is suggesting, between Yibum and Chalit, between Yibum and Eshasach, meaning the obligation to do Yibum and the problem of being involved with a sister-in-law, and bringing a korban on Shabbos, which I think is what you were asking me about. And however, it's not clear whether that's midin aseh dochalos aseh or it's just an independent halacha. The way that the Mechilta phrases it is that yibum v'chalitza b'dibur echad nemru, and zochar v'shamor b'dibur echad nemru, and umechalaleha mos yumas, which is the prohibition of violating malacha on Shabbos, and dubayom haShabbos, kivasim b'nei shana tamima, that the obligation to bring a korban on Shabbos, is b'dibur echad nemru. So the question is, what does b'dibur echad nemru mean? Is that another fancy way, or maybe a very specialized case of aseh dochalos aseh, or is that something that is completely independent from it? So that is actually a big debate. However, that's why, because I was concerned a little bit with that problem, I mean, it is an open question whether dibur echad b'dibur echad nemru, those cases are considered aseh dochalos aseh or some independent idea. The idea of them being an independent idea is the fact that there's an institutional relationship between the two. In other words, there's no such thing as korban musaf of Shabbos without chilul Shabbos. They have, without one being permitted, despite the other, the institution wouldn't exist. And the same thing is true about Yibum and the prohibition of Eshasach. If we were to stand, and insist on Eshasach, there would never be Yibum. And the same is true about Zochar and Shamor. They always go together. However, the case that I mentioned is a bit of a different case. It's not the classic case of Yibum and Eshesach. It's the case of Yibum where there's an additional Chayve Lav in addition to the Kares of Eshesach. Now, that would be the case that I gave, which was you have a Kohen Gadol, his brother is married. Let's say, have Ruvain the Kohen Gadol, and he has a brother named Shimon, who's not a Kohen Gadol. He's a Kohen, but he's not a Kohen Gadol. Now, Shimon is married to Sarah. So when Shimon dies, Sarah becomes an almana. Almana is typically not allowed to marry a Kohen Gadol, right? So now you have the mitzvah of Yibum on one side, and on the other side you have Eshesach, the fact that she's his sister-in-law. But in addition to that, she's also an almana. So as far as the relationship between a Yibum and a sister-in-law, that would be like Rabbi Roth is saying, that's institutional. That's like a korban on Shabbos. That's Mechalaleha Mos Yumas and Uviyom Shabbos. But the fact that she happens to be an almana and he happens to be a Kohen Gadol, that's not B'dibur Echad Nemru. That's just a coincidence. That's like any other Aseh Dochalos Aseh, which is why the Gemara, you can look at it for a moment. It'll be helpful, actually. Let's just turn to the Gemara for a second. But this is the Mishnah on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. The Mishnah on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph says as follows. Klal Amru B'Yavama. We have a principle when it comes to Yavama. Kol Shehi Asura, Kol Shehi Isur Erva. If she is prohibited to him in addition to being an Eshesach, for another reason, that is a chayve krisis, that is an erva. Like, let's say she is also his daughter, right? She's his sister-in-law and his daughter. Can a person be a sister-in-law and a daughter? Yes. Because a man is permitted to marry his niece, his brother's daughter. So he married his brother's daughter, right? So this man relationship, to this woman is she's his daughter and his sister-in-law at the same time, right? Okay, that's erva. So lo choletzes v'lo misyavemes. But the Mishnah then says Isur mitzvah v'Isur kedusha choletzes v'lo misyavemes. What is that? So the Gemara, towards the bottom of the page, if you look down on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, 8 lines from the bottom, the Gemara says kapasik v'tani lo shnomen anisuin lo shnomen erisin. I should say the end of the Mishnah, before we get to there. The end of the Mishnah explains what is Isur Kedusha, Almana LeKohen Gadol, where you have a widow who is now a Yibum candidate facing a Kohen Gadol, who normally she's prohibited to have relationships with. Grusha v'chalutza LeKohen Hedjon, or you have a Grusha, a divorcee, or a Chalutza, somebody who was subjected to Chalitza, and now they are in a Yibum encounter with a Kohen Hedjon, a regular Kohen, or Mamzeris and Nesina Yisrael, Bas Yisrael, and Nasin Mamzer. A regular, a man or a woman, a member of Klal Yisrael is not allowed to marry a Mamzer or a Mamzeras, meaning a child from an illicit relationship. So, but what happens if this becomes a Yibum situation? So again, now going back to the Gemara for a moment, this is 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. Kapasik v'tani, lo shlomen anisuin, lo shlomen erisin. The Gemara says, bishlom and anisuin, ase v'lo sase, ein ase docha lo sase v'ase. Elimina erisin, lo sase greda, yavo ase v'yidcha lo sase. So this is where the Gemara says explicitly that the principle of ase docha lo sase, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, applies for chayve lavin in Yibum. But Rabbi Roth, your case that you're talking about is not talking about a chayve lavin. The comparison to a korban on Shabbos or to, Zachar and Shamor is a Yibum case, which is a classic case, meaning she is otherwise, a stranger, except that she married his brother. So then you have an institutional clash between Yibum and Eshesach. Every case of Yibum is a case that deals with a woman who previously was married to your brother. But we're not talking about that case. We're talking about a case of what we call chayve lavin, in addition to the fact that she is the wife of your brother, or was previously the wife of your brother. In addition to that, she is also an almana, and you're a Kohen Gadol. So there, the Gemara says that works midin ase docha los ase. The question is then, if she, the woman, is not obligated in ibum, how could you say ase docha los ase? Both of them are violating the prohibition of almana, or the prohibition of grusha, or the prohibition of mamzer. So how could both of them be expected to do that when the justification appears only for the person who's doing the asay, namely the husband? So that's why the some of the Achronim conclude that really she is also obligated in Yibum. Is that clear? Okay. But the bigger point Rabbi Roth was making, which is that it's quite possible that we don't need the institution of asay docha los asay, of an asay thrusting aside a los asay, when it comes to classical yibum, regular yibum, not when there's chayve lavin, namely the clash between the mitzvah of yibum and the prohibition of eshes achiv. That is a very much a very relevant point. That's a big debate. What does it mean when we say yibum ve'eshesach b'dibur echad nemer? What does it mean when we say mechalel mos yumas and yom HaShabbos you should bring a korban? That is b'dibur echad. Okay, is everybody with me so far? Oh,
yeah.
anyway.
Rabbi, I wanted to ask you, if I may, a Kohen Gadol, can he resign his position in order to marry his brother's widow?
No.
So because he's not a Kohen Gadol anymore, so to speak. So I would like to do that. Number one. Number two, he can always, in order to get out of this tangle, do a chalitza and finish.
Right, but the point is that he could do that. We want to know if it's possible for him to do yibum. You understand? In other words, the Mishnah recommends that he do chalitza.
Right.
Gemara is asking if he wanted, he could apply the principle of asay docha los asay. If he wanted, he could do yibum. And remember, there is pressure to do yibum. It's preferable to chalitza. We don't do it in our time anymore, but because it's just very complicated. But
True.
all things being equal, there's a preference for yibum. And therefore, that's why the Gemara is asking, why do you, the Mishnah says that, here on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, that Mishum Isur Mitzvah and Isur Kedusha Choletzes V'lo Misavem. It's the Mishnah saying what you're saying. But the Gemara is asking, why is that the only option? Why don't you apply the principle of asay docha los asay? Okay. As far as the first question is concerned, even if he were to, for some reason, not be functioning as a Kohen Gadol, the status of Kohen Gadol is a sanctified personal status once he is a Kohen Gadol. And therefore, it's not like, he can abdicate like the King of England or something.
Or like the Pope, yeah.
Right, exactly. So, yeah. Anyway, so this is a very important question.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So the Minchas Chinuch has an interesting answer. So if you look in the Mar Makomos that we have, I want to read the line in the Minchas Chinuch, which is very interesting. They ask this question. This would be, I think it's on page 5. 1 second. Oh. Everybody have where it says Minchas Chinuch? Parshas Bereshis, Mitzvah Aleph Os Beis. If you go to the second paragraph, it's about in the middle of the second paragraph. It's on page 5. Everybody have it? Okay, I'll read the part anyway. So this is in the middle of the paragraph. So Vanir Lafi Aniasdaiti, the Minchas Chinuch wants to answer this question in a very interesting way. B'yishuv kushasa b'yibum, to solve the question from Yibum, namely, how can you apply the principle of ase dochalos ase, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, when it comes to Yibum, if she isn't also obligated, she doesn't have the ase, she only has the los ase. So the Minchas Chinuch says something very insightful. He says, Shlomar, Hare Ikar alos ase sha'isha muzeres bipsulim mevuar perikesh motaros the iskash isha leish. In almost every case where there is not all cases, he explains with this some discrepancies, but in many of the cases, or most of the cases, where there's an illicit relationship between a man and a woman, in almost all cases, her prohibition is formulated in the Torah on the basis of a hekesh, meaning he's the one who is told explicitly that it is prohibited. And then there's a hekesh, there's an equation between him and her. Whatever he's not allowed, whatever's a prohibited action for him is prohibited for both of them. So the Minchas Chinuch says something really fascinating. He says this isn't just a methodology of hermeneutics, how to learn this din. How do we know this rule that she is also prohibited in this relationship? The answer is, there's a hekesh, we equate ish v'isha, and therefore, if he's prohibited, then since she's his partner, she's prohibited as well. Says the Minchas Chinuch, it's more than that. What we're really saying is that she is prohibited because he is prohibited. In other words, he is the primary target of the prohibition. And as such, when she engages in this kind of behavior, which includes him and it's forbidden for him, then secondarily, it might be the same onesh, might be the same punishment, but secondarily, she is included within that action or prohibition. And if that's the case, says the Minchas Chinuch, then we could say the following interesting idea. The iskush isha leish, let me continue. The kol makom shehu muzar isha gamkein muzeres, when he is forbidden, she's forbidden. But in a way, what we're saying is she is forbidden to engage in an action in which he's forbidden. Ubiyibun kivin da ish eina muzar, the asya ase v'dachi los ase, he gamkein eina muzeres. So even though she doesn't have the positive command, she doesn't have the negative command because he has the positive command. In other words, he is allowed to override the prohibition because he has a positive command of the mitzvah vibum. But once that is true, then she's not prohibited either because her prohibition stems from the prohibition to him. And if it's permissible to him because of his aseh, then she's not violating anything, even though she doesn't have an aseh. So this is a very interesting, very controversial view of Minchas Chinuch, which is that in many cases of Isurei Bia, of prohibited or illicit relationships, her prohibition stems from and is secondary to, but also they're contingent upon the fact that he is prohibited. So that is the Minchas Chinuch's approach. Others just disagree, like the Aruch LaNer that I mentioned before, and say that she really is obligated in Yibum. Otherwise, you wouldn't apply the principle of Ase Dochalos Ase. Okay. Any questions on that, or we're clear? Okay, good. Having said that, I want to talk about one other issue or two other issues before we move back to the Gemara. And that is the following. If you look in the beginning of these Marmakomos, no, I'm not going to do that. Let's go to page 2 of the Marmakomos. And if somebody needs help to find them, if you're looking, just let me know, and I'll try to give you better landmarks if I'm not identifying it sufficiently. So you'll find a tshuva of the Rivash. Shelus and Tshuvas HaRivash, Siman Kufnun Tes. I'm going to talk about this first, and then I'll show you some lines in there. So this is the question. Let's say a person took an oath that he refuses to do Yibum or Chalitza. So the rule when it comes to oaths is that there's something called nishba levatel mitzvah, that if somebody takes an oath to cancel or to refuse to do a mitzvah, the oath is not binding. Called nishba levatel mitzvah, the shvua is not chal. So let's say a person, however, let me just add, let's say a person took an oath that included both something that is permissible and something that is prohibited. Let's say he said, I'm not going to eat matzah all year round. Now, if I'm not going to eat matzah all year round, that includes the week of Pesach, where it's a mitzvah. So he's taking a shvuah to negate a mitzvah. But mostly he's taking a shvuah on a dvar harishus, on something where there is no obligation. There's no obligation to eat matzah, any other week of the year except for
I
Pesach.
thought you can't make a net or a shua against the Torah, right?
That's what we're talking about. So when a person makes a shvuah against a mitzvah of matzah straight on Pesach, that's a shvuah against the Torah. Well, let's say he takes a shvuah and he says, I'm not going to eat matzah all year round. So that includes the week of Pesach, but it also includes every other week where there's no prohibition. So the halacha is in that case, that's called nishbal bekolel, meaning he's being mavliya, meaning he integrates a mitzvah into his oath, right? But it's not only the mitzvah is included in a larger oath, which is mostly not about a mitzvah. Everybody with me so far? And one more time. If you take a shvuah that you're not going to perform a mitzvah, the oath, the shvuah is not chal. It's not binding because you can't take a shvuah against the Torah. However, if you include in that shvuah something that is binding, because it's not about a shvuah, then even the against the Torah part will be binding with it as part of it. So shvuah shelo ochal matzah kol hashana is a binding shvuah. But if a person said shvuah shelo ochal matzah b'shvuas Pesach, that would not be binding. Okay, that's the background. So now the Rivash wants to know what happens if a person takes an oath and he says, I refuse to do yibum, I refuse to do chalitza. Is that shvuah binding? Well, what's the case? Case is as follows. Let's say there are four brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven is married. He dies and leaves no children. Right? Now, Shimon is the next older brother, but he is married to Reuven's wife's sister, meaning Reuven and Shimon married two sisters. That means that she is not a candidate for Yibum, because that's his sister-in-law, meaning the sister of his wife. She's both the wife of his brother and the sister of his wife. So she's excluded. He's excluded. He cannot do Yibum. However, there are two more brothers. The next in age are the one after that, Levi and Yehuda. So this is what happened. Levi is now supposed to do the Yibum, all things being equal, because he's the oldest available brother. The Torah said Bekor, and the drasha was whoever is the oldest available brothers has the first obligation to do Yibum. So what happens if the one who's the first available brother, meaning brother number 3, he gets up and he takes an oath and he says, I refuse to do Yibum, I refuse to do Chalitz. So then he says, well, then the candidate, even though the older brother is the first candidate, since he put himself into disqualification by taking a shvuah, right? So the youngest brother should do the Yibum. Does that work? Or the youngest brother saying, I don't think the shvuah that he took is meaningful because it's against the Torah to say I'm not going to do Yibum and I'm not going to do Chalitza. So this is the tshuva that the Rivash addresses. This is the question. I'm going to read the top of it if everybody has it. Odnistapakta, there's a suffix, meaning a doubt. Biyavama shenafla lefnei shlosha achim. You had 4 brothers, one of them who was married to this woman, and he died. And now there are 3 brothers left. V'hagadol shabahem, the oldest brother available, asurlo. He cannot marry her. He cannot have a relationship with her. Why? Shahaya nasui achosa, because he was married to her sister. I mean, 2 brothers, the 2 older brothers married 2 sisters. Niskotatu ashnei achim anisharim. So now a struggle, a dispute breaks out between the 2 remaining brothers. Hagadol kafat v'nishbash v'chamuran. The older of the 2 apparently learned a little halacha, so he jumped up and he made a shvua before it was too late. He took an oath, saying shelo yiyabem v'lo yachlotz, that he refuses to do yibum and he refuses to do chalitza. Basheni Omer, the second one, says, Alecha mitzvah, you're the oldest remaining brother, and it's your obligation. Ki ata gadol, the eini tzarich lishabol hachrim, v'kula mitzuyim ba'ir, im kofen legadol yabem o lachlots. Do we force the older brother to do yibum or not? Imeyos shenishba, considering that he took a shvua, an oath, everybody with me? So this is a fascinating case. So the Rivash, says like this. If he would, I'll read it inside in a second. Let me just talk it out for a minute. If the brother, the oldest available brother, had taken an oath only, I refuse to, I hereby promise I will not do yibum. But he didn't say anything about chalitza. That would not be a shua against the Torah. Because here there are 2 options. You can do yibum and you can do chalitza. However, considering that he says I won't do yibum or chalitza, so he's cut off both options, is that considered to be nishba levatel mitzvah, an oath against the Torah? Or will we say that since the first words that he utters, which are, I'm not going to be miyabem, when he says those words, it's not a shvua against the Torah because he could still do chalitza. But then when he adds afterwards, and I won't do chalitza, maybe it's like the matzah case, where I say I'm not eating matzah on Pesach, and I'm not eating matzah the rest of the year round. And we'd say that isn't nishba levatel mitzvah, because since there's a kolel part, since there's a larger, permissible shvua, so the fact that, there's also an element that targets directly a mitzvah is not relevant. So that is what the Rivash is struggling with. So one of the examples that he gives is as follows, and you'll tell me if you think this is a good example, and then I'll tell you what he says. Let's say a person makes an oath. He takes a shvua, and he says, I refuse to make kiddush on Shabbos. Not from wine, not from bread. There are 2 ways to make kiddush. You can make it with wine, you can make it with bread. So he gets up and he says, I'm not making kiddush. I'm taking a shvua that I'm not making kiddush on Shabbos, neither from wine nor from bread. Parallel to, I'm taking a shvua, I'm taking an oath, I will neither do yibum, nor will I do chalitza. Right? In both cases, the man has, in order to fulfill the mitzvah, he has 2 options. In one case, it could be yayin and pas, wine and bread. And in the other case, it's the 2 options are yibum and chalitza. So when he seemingly takes an oath, to do neither, whether it's wine and bread or chalitza and yibum, is that nishba levatel mitzvah or not? Well, take the case of the kiddush. I refuse to make kiddush neither on wine nor on bread. Is that a proper shvua or is that nishba levatel mitzvah? Anybody?
In
Everybody
the,
shy
in the
tonight.
case in the case of kiddush,
Yeah.
We can say maybe, I don't know. Please correct me if I'm wrong, which I probably am. That in the issue of the Kiddush and the issue of Yibum and Chalitza
Yeah.
cannot be compared.
Excellent. Why?
Because Yibum and Chalitza they have elements of Rachmones, maybe, an element of keeping the family together,
Right.
or whatever.
Why is that Rachmanis?
Or
Well, the
whatever.
Yibum is for sure.
Yeah, sure. In case of the Kiddush, of course, we have to say Kiddush either by wine or by bread, but it's not the same. I think the Yibum and Chalitza is far stronger
Oh,
and far more complicated.
so this is the question. So the way that you'll see in a moment, first, originally the Rivash compares the two. And what he says is, so let me take a step back for a second. What's so interesting about this tshuva, and there's an exchange with another contemporary, the Rashbats, the Tashbates. They knew each other, and they were both discussing this question, and they came up with different solutions. But the idea is as follows: Yibum and Chalitza is a very rare phenomenon. There's another case like it, and maybe a few cases like it, but it's very rare. Mostly when we have a mitzvah, we have a mitzvah. We don't typically have an alternative of mitzvos. In other words, you're obligated to do something or you're not obligated to do something. Here we have, you're obligated to do either this or that. You can't do Yibum and Chalitza together. Both of them are mitzvos aseh. We prefer, usually, according to most sources, we prefer Yibum to Chalitza. But in the end of the day, they're both mitzvahs aseh, and you can't do both. You have to choose one. So when you have to choose a mitzvah, that's very rare. Normally you have a mitzvah, you don't have a mitzvah. You don't have a choice to choose one mitzvah or another mitzvah. When it comes to Peter Chamor, it says either you break its neck or you are redeem it on seh. So, va'arafto. So pidyon or arifa, that's another example where you have two options. Are yayin and pas two options in Kiddush? Are they two options of the same mitzvah or two mitzvahs? Yibum and Chalitza and Kiddush for yayin and pas.
One mitzvah.
The Kiddush is one mitzvah.
Kiddush. Yeah, the Kiddush.
Exactly. So when it comes to Kiddush, there are two ways to do it, but it's still basically one mitzvah. Is Yibum and Chalitza one mitzvah with two ways to do it, or is it two different mitzvahs you just can't do? You just have to choose which one you're doing.
So you have the possibility to choose, and you do, and you choose.
Right, but is it what? So the Rivash initially says like this. He says, what is the mitzvah of Yibum? What is the mitzvah of Chalitza? Maybe it's to neutralize the limbo state of the woman. As the woman's husband dies, he has no children. She's in something called Zika. She's in limbo. She's not married yet to the Yavam, to the brother-in-law, and she's also not free to extricate herself from that family because there's still a hold on her through the Zika or through, the bond for the previous husband. Says the Rivash, is the mitzvah either to do Yibum or to do Chalitza, or is the mitzvah to neutralize her limbo state? And there are two ways to do it. One is through Yibum and one is through Chalitza. So if you say that the mitzvah in Yibum and Chalitza is one mitzvah, just two methods, and the mitzvah is to relieve the state of Zika, it's like yayin and pas. You have a mitzvah of Kiddush, and there are two ways to do it, to implement it. You have a mitzvah of silo kazika, expelling the bond between them, and there are two ways to do it. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, though, is what you just said a second ago, which is It's not that the mitzvah is to be masalek the zika. The zika is there to encourage you to choose what you want to do. And there are two opposite choices that you have. These aren't two methods of doing the same thing. You have two opposite choices. One is to complete the ishus, right, which is still, connected from the previous mace. That's evil. Or to eliminate the zika by freeing her from the zika. It's not the mitzvah isn't to get rid of the zika method A or method B. The mitzvah is either marry her or set her free, one or the other.
So the question is, are they two mitzvahs? Yibum is one and Chalitza is another one?
So in the Rambam's count, that's exactly it. The Rambam counts Yibum and Chalitza as separate mitzvahs. So does the Sefer Chinuch. No one ever counted Kiddush on Yayin and Kiddush on Pas as two different mitzvahs.
That's right.
So if you look in the language of the Rivash, you'll see this is the discussion. So what ends up being is a fascinating window into the thinking of these Chachamim about this very rare phenomenon, right? Which you also have in Petra Chamar, and Tifte Beset. But you almost have it in exactly the same way, at least almost no other time. And that is a situation where you are obligated to do either one mitzvah or another mitzvah that are quite different from each other, but that are independent. So what the Rivash says is as follows. I'm going to skip a little bit. See, he says, Aval nidon zeh, first he says, first he compares it to wine and bread. So this is in the middle of this first paragraph. Aval benidon zeh, beina yibum, beina chalitza, shtei mitzvah alav. The yibum and the chalitza are mitzvah. Shatorah chiva alav lesalek zikas achiv bahen be'echad mishteyem. The Torah commanded that we remove the zika. It's one mitzvah, he's saying. The mitzvah is get rid of the limbo. Either are two opposite ways to get rid of the limbo. It doesn't matter. Those are just details. The ikar mitzvah hu ayibum. The main preference is yibum. Kamosha el akronim. The mitzvah yibum kodem mitzvah chalitza. El shein kofen el yibum. Shakosov tola bechefzo. It says sheim lo yachbotz biyibum. He has a choice. Sheyachlots. The kofenoso lekayim mitzvah chalitza lo yirtza biyibum. L'chein zeh hagadol, the older brother, shamitzvah mutelos alav liftor zikas achiv biyibum o bechalitza. He has this obligation to neutralize the zika, either through completing it or removing it. The nishba shelo yiftar is what's he's taking a shua. He's saying, I'm not going to do either. When he says I'm not going to do either, he's not saying I'm not going to do A and I'm not going to do B. He's saying I'm not going to do the mitzvah, which can be done in two ways, but it's not two different mitzvahs. If you say it this way, lo b'yibum v'lo b'chlitza, hareza nishba levatel samitzvah mamish. V'hareza kenishba shelo yikadosh kiddush hayom. It's like a person says, I'm not making kiddush today, not with wine, not with pas, not with bread. Lo b'yayin v'lo b'pas. Devane habenishba levatel samitzvah v'lo chol olav hashvua. Afal pishem nishba shelo yikadosh b'yayin. It's true that if he had said, I'm not making Kiddush with Yayin, that wouldn't be Nishba Levatel mitzvah, because he still has the opportunity, the alternative of Pas. But if he says, I'm not going to do either Yayin or Pas, then he's basically making a declaration that he's not doing this mitzvah. So at this point, the Rivash thought that if I say I'm not doing Yibum and Chalitza, I'm not doing Yibum or Chalitza, he's saying I'm not going to remove the Zika, which is the mitzvah, not method A and not method B. That would be Nishba Levatel sa mitzvah. But then he says, Odye Shlomar, another way to look at it is, you can't compare wine, right, and bread as applications of a single mitzvah of Kiddush Hayom, you can't compare that to Yibum and Chalitza. Mishum dehasam ina yain v'pash shtei mitzvos. The bread and the wine aren't two different mitzvos. Ela chelke mitzvahim. There are details in one mitzvah. There are two ways to do it. The same mitzvah. Avokan Yibum v'Chalitza shtei mitzvos chalukosein. But Yibum and Chalitza aren't two methods to remove the Zika. They're two opposite mitzvos. Ha'achas lekarev, one which brings closer together the Yavama and the Yavam, meaning a kind of a marriage. V'ha'cheres l'rachek, and the other which drives a bigger wedge between them through Chalitza. V'im kein k'shechala shvu alachas she'izker rishona, shehilo rishus chala gam alo acheres bekolel. And therefore, since we're dealing with two different mitzvos, says the Rivash, when he first says the words, I'm not doing Yibum, that's not Nishba Levatel Sa mitzvah, because he has an alternative mitzvah to do Chalitza. Then when he says, I'm not doing Chalitza, that is Nishba Levatel Sa mitzvah, but it's already connected, Bekolel, it's already connected with part of the Shvuah, which is not Nishba Levatel Sa mitzvah. So maybe the Shvuah would be Chal and only the younger brother would be able to do the Yibum v'Chalitza. That is the view of the Rivash. Everybody with me so far? However,
Yes.
if you turn to the Tashbitz, it's just a very interesting, it's a legal question, and it really is highlighting how we look at this phenomenon of having two alternative mitzvos in the same circumstance.
I wanted to ask you, Rabbi, are there other mitzvahs, I cannot recall, but are there other mitzvahs where you have two alternatives?
Just Peter Chamor, Tifteh B'Seh.
Okay,
V'imla va'arafta.
Rafto. And that's it.
Right. So there also, and the Mishnah in Masechet Bechoros, the last Mishnah in the first chapter brings a few other examples also, but the closest are Pidyon Peter Chamor and Arifa Sakamor and Yibum and Chalitza. They're the closest. Okay. So the Tashbates, or the Rashbats, we have this here as well.
Rabbi, one question here.
Sure.
רגע, המקרה של רות ואבימלך,
עוד פעם?
והמקרה של רות, איזה מקרה זה? החליצה והייבום. במסכת רות.
B'Sefer. I mean, Boaz
בספר
and
רות.
Ruth?
כן.
What
מה,
about it?
איך זה מצווה אחת שמה לפי ההסבר שלך או שתיים?
Well, the story in Ruth and Boaz wasn't really
Boaz.
Yibum, it was what we call Geula.
כן.
So it was a little bit different because it wasn't a sister-in-law,
Mhm,
it was a broader relative.
mhm,
So that was what we called, Geula, not Yibum, but it was something comparable. But that we discussed already. That is the the Ibn Ezra in Perush on Ruth, and the Ramban in actually this week's coming Parsha is Vayeshev. That's where the Ramban discusses Yibum, the Ramban that we discussed so much. But those laws are similar but a little bit different. But the main example is Yibum v'Chalitza. Anyways, the Tashbates was or the Rab Shimon ben Bar Tzemach, Rab Yitzchak bar Sheshes was the Rivash, Rab Shimon bar Tzemach was the Tashbates. They were contemporaries, and they discussed this issue. The same case. You had four brothers. The first one died. The first and second were married to sisters, so the second brother wasn't a candidate to do Yibum. The third brother took an oath saying, I'm not doing Yibum, I'm not doing Chalitza. And the fourth brother is saying, you can't take an oath. The oath is against the Torah, so it's not binding, so you have to do it. They're not fighting who can be, the husband of this Yivama. They're fighting that the other one should be. everybody's being very generous or not. Okay. So that's the case. So if you look at the second paragraph, or you look at the end of the first paragraph for a minute, Ratzaha Rav Niru Lamud Bazel Daiti. This question was asked to the Rivash, he says, and then the Rivash consulted me for my opinion. Vinasati imo, and he said, and I discussed this back and forth. We negotiated this question, what the right ruling is. Harbe, pe el pe, mouth to mouth, meaning in person, we discussed this extensively. Because it got a little complicated, I wanted to make sure my position was understood accurately, so I wrote this letter to the Rivash explaining my own position. So what is his position? Let's look at the second paragraph. He said we have to make it clear that if the following happened, she'im nishba alachas mehem kagon shelo yavim v'lo tachlotz, yaven nishba levatos hamitzvah olo lechora nira she'im nishba shelo yavim v'lo chol olav shua demushba omei dechsiv yavama yavo aleha. So the Tashbit says, I disagree with the Rivash from the outset. Because what did the Rivash start out? What was the Rivash assuming all along? He has some doubts, but he's not doubtful about this. If the man took a shvuah, an oath, and said, only I won't do Yibum, or only I won't do Chalitza, is that shvuah binding or not? So the Rivash says, if he only took a shvuah on one, then that would be a shvuas rishus. That would be binding. That wouldn't be against the Torah, because if I take a shvuah, I'm not doing Yibum, I can still do Chalitza. As long as I can still do Chalitza, I remain with a halachic solution, says the Rivash. That's not called Nishba Levatel, that's a mitzvah. However, the Tashbetz disagrees. Says the Tashbetz disagrees. Why does he disagree? Because he says you're not allowed to take a shvuah. If the Torah wants you to do Yibum or Chalitza, you're still not allowed to take a shvuah that you're not going to do Yibum. Because that, even as an alternative, taking a shvuah against one of the two alternatives is a nishba levatel samitzvah. Iav a nishba levatel samitzvah lo lechora nira dim nishba shelo yiyavim de lo chol olav shvuah. If he just takes a mitzvah, I'm not going to be miyavim, even though he has the alternative of Chalitza. By eliminating Yibum through an oath, that's called Nishba Levatel Samitzvah. Why? The Mushba the Omedu, the Ksiv, Yavama, Yavo the Torah said you should do Yibum. Certainly that's true if Yibum is preferred. He said, this is a bigger Kiddush. He says, even if it were true that Chalitza is preferred, and you took a shvuah that you're not going to do Yibum, even that would be wrong. Because, in the end of the day, even if Yibum is second choice, for practical reasons, in the end of the day, making a shvuah against Yibum is nishba levatos hamitzvah. Ha shariat Torah chibasa liyabim mishum mitzvah mishum chshasha d'shem yichnas l'shem amrina the mitzvahs chalitza kodemes. Let's get the next paragraph for a moment. If you were to take a shvuah only that he won't do chalitza, to have a rishus v'chol olav shua, it would seem that would be permissible because he has the alternative of yibum. However, says the Tashbetz, even that I think is wrong. Lav hara dershus the efshel adamos lemishnishba shel yitam klum biyom tov l'Rab Lazar desfir la okul Lashem okulak. Till the day simcha samta for shus afilu hachi mashma shanishba shel yitam klum avinishba levatel. What is he saying? He's saying in addition to wine and bread for kiddush and yibum and chalitza and pidyon, peter chamor, and arifa sachamor, right? There's another maybe model or paradigm. And that is on Yom Tov. How do you spend Yom Tov? So there's a debate between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yoshua. How much physicality, enjoyment, on Yom Tov, and how much spirituality, shiurim, davening, etc. So the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Yoshua, chatzi lachem and normally chatzi lachem and chatzi lashem, meaning we a day of Yom Tov for a day of Shabbos is a balanced day, right? It's part for God and part for you. That's what most of us do. However, Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion that it's O kulul Hashem, O kulul lachem. You have a choice either to make this a very spiritual day or to make it a very physical day. So what would happen? Basically, every Yom Tov, you have a choice, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Not every Yom Tov, but most Yom Tovim, you have a choice. So let's say he took a shvuah and he said, I am not going to spend this day Lashem. And then 10 minutes later he said, and I'm not spending it Lachem either. What would happen in that case? Would that be Nishba Levata L'Sam Mitzvah? Can you compare Yibum and Chalitza as alternatives, but they're two separate mitzvos, two alternative separate mitzvos? Can you compare that to two different ways of spending or characterizing the single mitzvah of Shabbos or the single mitzvah of Yom Tov? So that is what the Tashbates really analyzes. So what comes out of all this is a very fascinating argument about the nature of Yibum and Chalitza. There are some who think that really the mitzvah of Yibum, and if you don't do Yibum, then Chalitza is like a tikkun. It's like the compensation after the fact. But there aren't really two separate mitzvahs. It's a mitzvah of Yibum and it's a rescue plan of Chalitza. That's one way to look at it. The other is you have two completely independent mitzvahs. You can't accomplish both at the same time because whenever you do one, you preclude the other. But each one is independent of the other. Each one is a potential expression that is appropriate under these conditions. So instead of saying the chalitza is like a tikkun, for the abstention of the yibum, what we're saying is there are two different mitzvos. You're obligated to do one of the two, meaning both, but you can't do them both because once you do one, you can't do the other. So either one ends up being what you choose, but it's really two different mitzvos. And in between that, we're saying something like this. And that is the mitzvah is to remove the zika, the limbo. Just that there are two methods of doing that. It's like wine and bread in Kiddush. Just like wine and bread in Kiddush isn't two mitzvos, it's two methods of doing the same mitzvah. So too, Yibum and Chalitza, it's not that Chalitza is a backup, but it's also not two independent mitzvos, right? It is two ways of doing Siluk HaZika. And then you have this other possibility, and that is that it's really two independent mitzvos, but each one, right, is subject to the principle of Nishba Levatel Es HaMitzvah. Okay? So it's a very interesting case that it's interesting how these things, develop. This seems like it was an actual case, and the case kind of forced these great authorities to articulate in a very precise way what the relationship is between Yibum and Chalitza, given that it's very rare to have two alternative mitzvos, that to solve a single problem. It's a single problem, but two mitzvos to solve it, as opposed to, one mitzvah and another, compensation, or two methods of accomplishing exactly the single same principle, like Hafkas Hazika. So it emerges a full range of interesting ideas about the relationship between Yibum and Chalitza for the Rivash and for the Tashbetz. Are there any questions before we move on for a few more minutes? Because we have a...
Yes, if I may.
Sure.
It seems to me that in the case of Kiddush, whether you do it on bread or wine, it's Mekadesh et Shabbat is the goal. And therefore, whether you do it, it's really two methods of completing one mitzvah.
Same mitzvah. Right.
Now, in Yevum Chalitza, Yevum is the goal of to ligdol et shmo Yisrael, while Chalitza has the goal of freeing her up from being in limbo.
Right.
Two different goals, and therefore, Yevum is the mitzvah. Chalitza is actually the denial of the mitzvah.
It's almost like the punishment for not doing it.
Yes.
Right. So that is what the Rivash actually concludes in that tshuva. First, he thinks that it's like pas and yayin, two methods, and the real mitzvah is simply removing her from a limbo state. And then finally, he says exactly what you say, which is, no, it's not two methods of one mitzvah. It's two opposite mitzvos. The preferred one is to complement, the zika and complete it. And so she'll be his wife. And then the alternative is to the opposite, and that's to remove not to complete the zika, but to remove the zika. So the two alternatives are just, are not solving the zika. They happen to solve the zika, but that's not what the mitzvah is. The mitzvah is lekarev and lisa osa. And the alternative is, if not that, then give her a get or give her a chalitza. And that's exactly the case. Yeah.
And suppose, Rabbi, that she refuses to be meyubemet,
Right.
if the word like that, meyubemet, and she refuses to do chalitza. Is she breaking a mitzvah? Is she commanded?
That's a great question too. So there's a tshuva of the Chacham Tzvi.
My grandfather, yeah.
See, you're thinking in his lines. The first tshuva, if you have it in the sefer, do you have the sefer in the house?
I do.
Yeah. So the first Siman Aleph.
You're talking about the Shalis and Chuvas?
Yeah.
I have it. I have to get it from another room now. I don't know.
Yeah, you don't need it right now. I'm just telling you, it's interesting. It's what's interesting about it is that this is the first the first of the Chuvot is on this topic.
Really?
He wants to know, you have I think if I remember correctly, the case, it was a very old woman and her husband died and didn't have any children, but she's already long past childbearing age and so on. And the question is, does the brother-in-law have he doesn't want to do Yibum, but she doesn't want to do Chalitza. She's the active party in the Chalitza, right? So she says, listen, I don't care that I'm in limbo. I'm 95 years old. I'm 99 years old. I'm 102 years old, whatever it is. She's saying, so the Yibum, is not going to help me. And the Chalitza at this point, is just unpleasant for me. I don't mind being in limbo. If I don't mind, then you should leave me alone. So that's what the Chassam Sofer discusses. He wants to know, is there only a mitzvah of Yibum? Is it also a kinyan? Is it an obligation? Or does it depend on what she wants and what she needs? And in the end, I believe he concludes that if she's not interested and she doesn't mind being in limbo, that would be perfectly fine.
Is there a time limit to when Yivum or Chalitza has to be performed?
No, there is not. Which is interesting. Again, on a rabbinic level, we don't want to, delay these things forever.
Yes.
Because
if the purpose is not to leave her in limbo, then it would seem there should be a time limit.
Right. But there isn't formally a time limit. Rabbinically, they push to get it done, expeditiously as possible, because it's not a healthy situation for her to be in that kind of limbo. However, Minat Torah, according to biblical law, there is no statute of limitation. There's no technical time frame.
Because she might want to prefer a different candidate to marry a second time, other than the brothers.
Yeah, well, she might
And
prefer chalitza.
She might prefer chalitza.
Yeah, for sure. And if she refuses yibum, mostly we respect her wish, just as if he refuses, we respect his wish. So then it would what the Chacham Tzvi is speaking about, there's not going to be yibum. Question is, she says, I don't need chalitza either. Usually there would be chalitza, which would free her to marry someone else. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to stop in a minute, but let me just
Jet lag.
I'm sorry?
You're jet lag.
No, not jet lag. I just we only have a couple of minutes left. I just don't know whether I'm not going to start the
Okay.
mission. So I do want to speak about the Sefer HaChinuch though for just a minute. So if we can go back to page 1 for a minute of these promos. And again, next week we'll have a shiur, just to remind everybody before we on Monday night I'm giving a shiur in memory of my mother's yahrzeit, and everybody's invited either in person or on Zoom, and that was advertised, I believe. On Tuesday, we're having, as part of our regular shiur, a shiur on the topic of Chanukah, and as it stands now, it's on Zoom. If that changes, Jacob, you'll let me know. Right? Yeah. Okay. So the Sefer HaChinuch.
Yes.
Yeah. The Sefer HaChinuch has an interesting take on the mitzvah of Yibum that I wanted to leave you with as well. And then the next time we continue with Yevamos, we'll start doing the topic of Erva and Tzara and the Daf Beis and Gimel. Gimel, really. So the Sefer HaChinuch explains that the nature of the mitzvah of Yibum isn't really, at least initially, isn't such a mystical idea, but it is an idea of finding almost like a replacement for his spiritual good deeds, of the deceased. I just think it's an interesting perspective, and I want to contrast it to the Sefer Abatim in the few minutes that we have left. So on page 1, we have Shenitztava Mishamei Sachim, the person whose brother died is obligated, below Iniach Banim, and when his brother didn't leave children, Likach Eshes Achiv Hameis, to marry or to take the sister-in-law, his brother's wife, Liisha, he should marry her. V'zeu anikra yavam b'Torah u'b'divrei Rabbeinu zikaron livracha. Al zeh nemar yavamo yavo aleh. Mishrashi mitzvah. Let's listen to this. Very interesting. At the heart or the core of this mitzvah, sha'isha achar shenises li'ish harei ke'echad me'yavara. The bond between a husband and wife is very powerful, very intense. And after this marriage takes place, she becomes a part of him, ki'ilu. Where does that come from? The idea that a woman is almost like, physically connected to her husband, but certainly existentially connected, from Adam and Chava. Shekain, it's just interesting, chinuch. Shekain yechayev hateva, this is a natural, he says, circumstance. Mipnei ma'isa ha'ava rishon shelokech hachas misalosa v'menu bana lo hakel isha. From the story of Adam and Chava, we see that the relationship of husband and wife, he says, etzem me'atzami, basar me'bsari, is supposed to be almost like they're attached at the hip, I guess you'd say. V'ha'ish shemes b'lo banim, shi'alo chelik mimenu l'zikron lo l'malos mekoma ba'olam avod tisporo. So then the idea is that we want to find a way to continue the legacy of the mace by having someone take his place or replace him, right, in terms of engagement in the things that he would have done for Avodas Hashem, for serving the Ribbon Shalom. Ba'od ein zecher lo ba'olam agufani zulasi zosa isha she etzem yatzama v'basar mibsaro. Right, the closest thing to him in terms of a bond and a legacy in this world is his wife. V'hoya mechasido akelo hakim lo zera mimena oidei achiv shehu gam kein kechatzi b'saro k'di she'oso azera mimale mekoma v'od v'od boro takta v'yizaka el yodo b'olam haneshamos asher hu sham. So he says, if you take the two things in this world that are, closest to the mace, namely the bond he has with his wife, etzam yatzami basar mibsari, which is what, the language of the Torah in the context of Adam and Chava, the paradigm of husband and wife, right? If you take that plus the person in this world, maybe who is closest, DNA-wise to him, which is his brother from his father, better even if it's father and mother, same father and mother. So then you combine, the avar or etzem, me'atzamai of the wife and the ach me'av of the brother, and what you produce is someone who at least approximates, both in all respects, especially values-wise, a substitute or replacement, in Avodas Hashem for that person on this world. And that is how the Sefer Chinuch formulates the mitzvah of Yibum. Kadeshi Yosa Zera Mimale Mekoma Ve'oved Boro Tachta V'Yizake El Yodo Be'olam HaNeshamos Asher Husham Kemoshe Adua De Bra Mizaka Abba Shekein Amru, according to the Bracha, Bra Mizaka Abba Abba Lo Mizaka Bra. Okay. Then he goes on to say, so whose child really is it in legacy? The child of the biological father, the DNA was the DNA, his own DNA running through this child? Or is it the deceased because it's his original wife that he chose and that she chose him, plus the brother? So in some respects, the legacy of this child is kind of mixed between, the father, the biological father, and the uncle who motivated all of this to begin with. So that's what the Chinuch goes on to say as follows. The living brother, Asher Holid Abanim Min Hayivama, the real biological father, Gamelav Chelik Bahem. Of course, he also has, a part in this child. B'zocha Gam Hu B'schusam. I mean, Kibbut Av V'Eim goes to him, right? And the Yerusha comes from him, from that father. Amnam lo hayolazeh kol azchus ki gam achiv yitol chelko b'shvil hachelek hagadol sheyesh lo bahem v'hi ha'isha shenafla lechelko b'tchila k'moshe amarnim. Meaning, each one has something to recommend his dominance. You have the biological DNA of the second brother, but you also have the mother who's a carryover of the first marriage. So that is where you get both. So that's what Onan said in this week's Parsha, which we're going to read this Shabbos, right? Vayeda Onan, right? Ki lo azara, like a double lo, but a lo with the vav and a lo with the mitan aleph. So Onan knew that the seed, the children, wouldn't be his. In Yano, what does that mean? Lomar ki calls lo yellow. He wouldn't be the exclusive father figure of this child. She'achiv, meaning the brother who died, right? Yitol chelik behem u'lemiktzas haskus lo yachoshesh ki gam ulai she'ikar haskus la'achames shu kibala karka va'achachai ka'aris u'kinin shaduash be'erisin. I'm sorry, be'erisin. He says it's like a sharecropper, who owns the field and who's doing the work in the field. So a sharecropper, sometimes provides the seed, also. It's like very graphic, example. So what he's saying is there are two fathers here. One is the Balakarka, that's the Achiv Ames, and the other one is the Aris, that's the Achiv Achai. And really, they are partners in this endeavor. That is the position of the chinuch. But I want to conclude with the position of the Migdal David. The Migdal David is Reb David Kochavi. He wrote a sefer called Sefer Abatim, mostly on the Rambam, but also on the Gemara. And he also wrote a Sefer Mitzvos, also patterned after the Rambam, but then he also gets more expansive. And it's called Migdal David, because his name was Reb David Kochavi. So on this mitzvah, go to the second paragraph. He says, "Yearly ki'inin zeh minhag kadum haya derech yosher v'hachemla." The goal of Yibum is empathy and justice. Because a woman who gets married, she leaves the protection of her own home, and she enters into another family. She ends up, betaking herself into the husband's family. And indeed, the husband even inherits her Yerusha, which is the story of B'no Safkad, by the way. Once she leaves the protection of her father's home, who's going to look after her interests if not her husband? But therefore, if he dies early, so she is in this circumstance. She was married. That makes her less marriageable going forward on the market. And kasher ein lo zera, she has no child from this husband in this family to serve as her, protector. Chutra means a makel, a staff, meaning it says expression in the Gemara. If she doesn't have a child, in Gemara Ksuvas, if she doesn't have a child, she doesn't have anyone to protect her. So what the Sefer Abatim is describing is a totally different perspective than the Chinuch. Chinuch is explaining why the child is a legacy, almost like a replacement in Avodas Hashem for his uncle, his deceased uncle. And the Sefer Abatim is saying, this isn't about children, it's not about the dead brother, it's really about protecting the interests of the wife in the context of this new family. Therefore, this child and the remarriage to the brother-in-law is a way of protecting her and providing for her in a dignified manner. Okay, I'm going to stop here. When we pick up in 2 weeks, we'll start moving straight and talking about Erva and Tzaras Erva, very interesting topics. So we'll need the Gemara especially, and I'll put in more Marmakomos, but definitely we need a text of the Gemara next time. And yeah, and happy Hanukkah to everyone, and we'll see you either once or twice or not next week. But as things stand, everything Tuesday will be on Zoom. Monday is either Zoom or live for anybody who wants to join. Thank you. Have a good day.
Good night.
Yeshua.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.